Good evening, and welcome to another dreadful tale. Tonight's dreadful tale is the tale called The Medium's Warning. It's about a man, some chocolates, and a young bride who dies under mysterious circumstances. So sit back, relax, but don't bite into those chocolates just yet. Not until you hear The Medium's Warning. Regret to inform you, Mrs. Johnson died in London Wednesday. According to her request, was buried Abbey Chapel Thursday. Clay Hemington, American Embassy, Henry Joyson, held the cablegram in his hand for a long moment, staring at its message, and then finally crumpled it up in his hand. "Any message, sir?" the startled messenger boy he'd left standing on the threshold asked as he started to turn away. "No," Henry said abruptly. Then as the messenger started to leave, he said, "Wait a minute. Yes, there is. Give me one of those blanks." Quickly he snatched the blank and scribbled, "Arriving by plane to claim wife's effects, Henry Joyson." Henry Joyson was a man of action. And the moment the door closed behind the messenger, he strode upstairs and began packing. He knew there wasn't a moment to lose. He must get to England without delay. For a moment, as he locked his grip, he seemed to hear Gloria's voice saying softly the words from the marriage ceremony that had taken place just 6 short months ago. "Remember, Henry, it's until death do us part." That's what she said, right after they were married. That's what she reminded him of when he'd asked, no, pleaded for a divorce, sick of this woman, who was always clinging to him, who seemed to have no life, no desires, no interests other than loving him. When he'd asked for his freedom, she'd lifted her pale face, still filled with its dog-like expression of devotion, and she'd said lovingly, "No, Henry, I won't. Remember, Henry, it's until death do us part." And it was her words that had given him the idea, at first a shocking, abhorrent idea, and later one he became used to. If she were dead, he'd be free, and more. He would have the wealth of his rich dead wife to indulge his luxury-loving heart. But now something had gone wrong. She had died too soon. He knew as he slammed the door behind him and made his frantic dash for the airport. The trip across the Atlantic seemed interminable to Henry Joyson. And the moment he'd cleared through customs in England, he went immediately to the American Embassy in search of Clay Hemington, who had sent the cablegram. "I'm Henry Clayson," he announced, without preliminaries. "I've come in the matter of my wife's death." Clay Hemington proved to be a tall, slow-spoken Westerner with a drawl that strained Henry's patience. He thumbed through the file of cards and finally extracted the one that read, "Joyson Gloria, deceased." "Ah, yes," Hemington said, "very sad and unexpected, your wife's death." "Of course," Henry said impatiently. "But I'm here to claim my wife's effects and take her body back to America." Clay Hemington lifted his eyebrows. "Oh, I'm afraid that's impossible," he said. "Your wife was buried in the Abbey Chapel in accordance with her request. But her effects are in the next room if you care to go through them or take them with you." Left alone in the next room, Henry Joyson began eagerly to paw through the reminders of his dead wife's existence, letters, her clothes, a few trinkets. And when he'd finished, they weren't there. The thing he dreaded had happened. The jewels, the precious jewels he killed her for were gone. Finally finished, Henry leaned against the wall and lit a cigarette. Everything had gone well up to the last moment. That final action that was to bring him wealth upset his careful plans. When the idea of killing her finally took root in his mind, he fed her careful dosages of arsenic in her food until she grew pale and listless and complained of pain. And then he suggested carefully to her one evening, "Darling, why don't you take a trip abroad? I can't get away, but it would do you a world of good." "I'll miss you terribly," he continued tenderly. "But then there will be the excitement of having you return home to me." He held his breath, waiting her reply, while his hand tenderly caressed her hair. "All right, Henry," she said obediently. "If you think it's best for me." She turned her large, luminous, pale blue eyes upon him, devouring him, it seemed to Henry, with their glance. She'd taken her jewels with her, that vast fortune which it was her idiosyncrasy always to carry with her. And when he cautioned her about carrying them around, she'd written from England, "I put them in a safe place, somewhere where no one will get at them." But after she'd left, her letters had become gayer, and she regained her strength, and finally expressed her longing for him, and her wish to return. Henry had granted that wish, bade her come back to him, and then when he'd known exactly when her ship was sailing, he sent the box of chocolates, each one carefully filled in its center with poison. He mailed the box to the ship, sure it would be delivered to her once she was on board. Then, according to his plan, he would be at the dock to receive his dead wife when the boat landed. There would be no guilt, no suspicion attached to him, and the jewels she always carried with her would have been his. Now, from Clay Hemington, he'd learned what had gone wrong. The ship had delayed sailing, and the chocolates had been forwarded to Gloria at her hotel. And now she was dead and buried in England, beyond his reach, and the jewels were beyond his grasp. And now, as Henry Joyson left the embassy and walked slowly down the street, he determined he would not leave London until he found that treasure. For hours he prowled the murky, foggy, bound streets, trying to figure out where his wife had secreted the jewels. And it was thus, perhaps by chance or maybe by design, that he came across a small shop that bore the sign, "Madame Zura, Medium," and beneath it the inscription, "I contact the dead." The idea came full-blown to him, and without hesitation he opened the door and entered the dark, draped room with the crystal ball upon the table, the star of the zodiac hanging just above, and Madame Zura seated in the chair as if she were expecting him. Quickly, Henry stated his purpose, and Madame Zura moved closer to the table and prepared to invoke Gloria's spirit. And then, in the midst of her incantations, she stopped and stared at Henry. "The spirit claims you harmed her," she stated. "She does not wish to speak to you." "Can you make her?" Henry demanded. "I can compel her to speak, but remember, if you have evil in your heart toward her, to take what belongs to the murdered dead gives them a supernatural power beyond the grave over you." For a moment Henry hesitated, but then he thought of possessing the jewels. But then the thought of possessing the jewels overcame him. A ghost can do me no harm. I demand that the spirit answer me. Madame Zura fell silent in her concentration, and finally the room filled with a bluish light. And before Henry's tensed gaze, Gloria took a translucent form. She was wrapped in her grave shroud, the white cloth flowing around her, and her large blue eyes were filled now with a hate that crawled around the room. "You killed me," she moaned. "You murdered me. And now you won't let me rest." Henry Joyson clenched the arms of his chair. "The jewels," he demanded hoarsely. "Where did you put them?" For a moment she stood there, and there was silence, and she refused to answer him. "What did you do with the jewels?" Henry demanded in a louder voice. "You must answer me, you bodiless, spineless creature. I command you to." "I hid them," she said in a wailing whisper. "I hid them in the woods back of the hotel." Henry rose in his chair, and now eagerness replaced any trace of fear in him. In death as in life, Gloria was his to command. "Show me where they are," he demanded. Slowly she walked ahead of him down the stairs, and her white grave shroud floated behind her so that he could almost touch it. It was midnight, dark outside, and lonely, with no passer-by. They traversed the streets that way, and when they got past under a lamppost, the light shone through her as through the fog that had capriciously taken shape. And finally they came to the hotel, and to the grounds that surrounded it, and she stopped before one tree whose trunk was old and hollow. Unable to restrain himself longer, Henry dashed toward the treasure, but she stood in front of it. "They're mine, these jewels," she said in a wailing whisper. "They belong to me. You married me for these jewels, but they're mine in death as in life. Take them, and you marry me again in death." But Henry Joyson plunged through the apparition guarding it and seized the chest of jewels. He knew victory as he felt the smooth leather box in his hands, and he heard the precious stones loose within roll against each other within his movements. The wraith had torn apart like wisps of fog when he had plunged through it, but now it was suddenly aware, and it had reformed and enveloped him so that he was enclosed in a cold, swirling mist through which he could not see. And then he felt her cold hands about him, clutching him. And she said in a loving whisper, "Now, Henry, you're mine once again." Even as he tried to twist out of the grip of the thing that held him, the shroud tightened around his throat, and he could not breathe. He clutched the jewel case tightly to him, and with his other hand he tore madly at the wrapping entwining him. But finally his struggles ceased, and he knew no more. Thus they found Henry Joyson the next morning, He lay upon the cold, dew-soaked grass. One arm still enclosed the chest of jewels. He looked much as though he'd been overcome by some swift and sudden ailment, the blood rushing all to his head. But then there was the piece of the torn white cloth. He clutched it in his other hand, the sort of cloth that is used unmistakably by undertakers in shrouding the dead. I hope you enjoyed tonight's dreadful tale, and I hope you join me again for the next dreadful tale.